right, everyone, welcome back. Today I have an exciting piece I want to talk about. It's a giant killer, a true giant killer, not one where the manufacturer is calling it a giant killer, but one where after I listened to it, after I compared it to much more expensive products, I have declared this HiFi Rose RD160 as a giant killer of a DAC, but it's so much more than that. In this video, I want to talk to you about the specs and features really quick, what makes it different. I want to talk about my experience using it for the past couple of months with different amplifiers and different speakers. I want to talk about using it as a preamplifier, using it as your main digital source. I'll also talk about it using it with the RS130 and the USB fiber connection, as well as other streamers, the Nagra streamer. So I've put this thing through its paces. It's a DAC, it's a preamp, and it's really, really unique. And it comes in at $5,300, around the same price range as the brand's flagship streamer, the RS130, that this is made to connect with. They go together like macaroni and cheese, like peanut butter and jelly, and I want to talk about it and share this information with you. Before we get started, I got to thank John over at Lone Crow Audio. He's the one who sent me the RD160 for review a couple months back, and he carries the full HiFi Rose line. He carries other brands as well, and when he sent this to me, he had listened to it for a little while, and he said, I think it kind of hangs with the Weiss 501, which blew me away. And then it arrived, and I installed it, and I listened for myself. Before we get to that, and I also want to talk about how I upgraded this with sort of a tweak to bring it closer to a level of a 50K DAC. I'll talk a little bit about that. I'll try not to drag this video on, so let's get started. So first of all, this DAC is in an all-metal enclosure. It's a very unique design, different from the RS130 that it's really built to go with. Now, make no mistake, it's not just for the RS130. This is a DAC for any system, and it can bring its sound, which is very refined and is indeed very much like the original Weiss 501, a $10,000 DAC. It brings that solidity, that energy, but yet the warmth and immersiveness somewhat. I'll get more detailed on that in a second. So this thing has like a hidden display from the future. It's all sleek black. And when you turn it on, you'll see 3 different kinds of displays you can cycle through. It's really, really cool. There's also the menu, which is very easy to understand. Let's take a quick look at the menu up close, as well as the rear of the DAC. All right, so here is the front panel of the display here. You have a volume knob, your power button. You can see as I turn it up and down, the volume changes. This is a very cool display. When you play music, you have the sound wave that displays here, and this shows you the path that everything is taking. I have the coaxial input active, going to the short, slow filter, going to the internal clock with the upsampling setting that goes to the output. So that's pretty cool. You have a dimming button here, a mute button here. You can change your inputs here, right? We'll go to the other display. There we go. So this changes your inputs here, I2², USB, the fiber, and filters are here. Short, slow, super slow, low, short. You also have short, sharp, and slow and sharp. I didn't really hear many differences in these filters, but I did hear differences in the upsampling modes. So we have where it takes whatever you feed it and it'll upsample it, right? You can also upsample it to DSD or sample it to DSD, or you can go to PCM, or you can bypass altogether, which is no oversampling at all. At the end of the day, I've listened to these extensively. The upsampling sounds the best to my ears. So here we have the menu screen display. Hopefully you guys can see it. That's the pre-out level setting here. So you can go 1 volt in balanced as low as 0.5 volts in RCA. And you can go up to 9 volts output, 9 volt output, balanced, unbalanced 4.5. There's an active standby setting. where you can have it to never go into standby. 20 minutes is default. For some reason, I have this one set to 2 hours. There's also a screensaver, when you can choose to change it to the full screen sound wave or to turn off the screen altogether. So the DAC module in the RD160 is also unique. It's from AKM and it uses the Velvet Sound technology. But what's cool is there's 2 different chips here. One handles the digital to analog conversion. That's all it has to do. And the other chip handles all the filtering. So that's pretty cool as well. And I think that is also what makes this DAC somewhat overly refined compared to DACs in its price range. Another thing that adds super refinement to this DAC, and I love that Rose did this, and I do not see it in mostly any other DACs. I'll give you an example. Nagra, the tube DAC, that's $50,000+. It has 37 individual power supplies inside of the unit, powering 37 different parts, 37 different things inside the enclosure. Now, most DACs have 1 power supply. Many DACs have horrible singular power supplies. The RD160 has 3 power supplies. 1 powers the digital side, and 1 powers the analog side, or 2 for the analog side, the left and right. And this goes a long way into eliminating more noise, more hash, more grain, and it adds a refinement to the DAC. That's another thing I'm really excited about here. Another thing I love about this DAC is it has variable output, and you can choose between 1 volt all the way up to 9 volts of output. And this is awesome. Say you're hooking it up directly to a power amp, and I'll use the example of the Singzer SA90s that I had recently here for review. These are $1,400 monoblocks, Class AB, very high quality for the money. I hooked up the RD60 to it direct, and I ran it just with my Nagra streamer and a coax output. Using the RD160 as a preamp, I set the variable output first at 1 volt. It was too weak, and then I tried it all the way up down the line. I settled at 3 volts for those Singer monoblock amps because they're kind of a lower gain design. It sounded maybe a little better at 4 volts, but at 3 volts, I'm hearing more of the amplifier and less of the preamp. If I went up to 7 volts, I'd hear more of the preamp and less of the amplifier. So that pairing was absolutely incredible when I added the Pure Audio Project Duet 15 speakers that I have here, own and love. The sound was remarkable just with the RD160 hooked up to those $1,400 monoblock amps. When I hooked up this DAC to a Nagra Classic amp, which is to me a world-class, one of the most beautiful amplifiers in the world, right? Regardless of cost. The sound was organic, heavenly, spatial, immersive, and I was hearing not only the Nagra character, but I was hearing that RD160 character. Again, it's solidified. It's a little bit of warmth. It doesn't have anything lean about it, and it has a nice sound stage with decent depth, but not crazy. It's not the tallest, and the imaging kind of stays within the speakers, but in a unique full-bodied way. Again, it's like the Weiss 501. That's what it reminds me most of in sound, though the Weiss is probably a little more refined still. So hooking it up to that Nagra Classic amp was beautiful. Hooking it up to the T+A PA3100 HV integrated amp that I recently reviewed, this DAC did amazing. It even had more balls, more slam, more impact just due to the high energy of that amp. That was a stunning combo as well. Now, let's talk about it in comparison to some other DACs. So in its price range, I can't think of any DAC that competes with it, but we'll talk about the Dana-Fripp's Pontus 15th, which I have extensive experience with. This is a $3,000 DAC, so it's less money. It has very good details that jet out, but the Dana-Fripp's Pontus 15th is leaner overall from top to bottom. It doesn't have the solidified body of the Rose. The Dana-Fripp's is a little more detail-oriented coming out at you with that Pontus 15th, where the Rose is more about a vibe, more mellow, more immersive, though it's not massively immersive. I'll touch on that in a second. Overall, this RD160 to me sounds quite a bit better than the Dana Fripp's Pontus 15th, but it's $2,300 more expensive, I believe, as well. It's just more refined, more silky, more textured. It is a DAC that hits above its price point, which is why I'm calling it a giant killer. Now, when I compared it against, say, the Nagra Tube DAC, the Tube DAC to me, it's over $50,000, but man, what a beautiful experience that DAC was. That was, up until that time, the most immersive DAC I ever heard, and the RD160 couldn't really get close to it. But I had a package arrive from Mod-Ride Instruments, and it was their analog bridge. And what this device is, it's a black box, very handsome looking, 5 tubes up top. And I placed this in between the DAC, the RD160, and the classic amplifier, the Nagra Classic. And what this device does, this bridge, is add some warmth, some tube glow, some tube character to an all solid state system. So if you have a solid state system that sounds a little sharp, a little lean, a little bright, an analog bridge like this can really, or at least that's what they say, can really flesh it out, warm it up, and bring you some tube magic without the distortion. I was a little skeptical of it, but I put it in there, I turned it on, I let it warm up. I chose the 6SN7 tubes because there's a switch on the front that lets you choose the flavor of tube you want, right? You can go with the 6SN7s. There's some smaller tubes up front. And so I flicked it to the 6SN7, ready to hear some slight differences, but I was blown away at what happened. The soundstage grew in width, in depth, in height, and the details were more organic. They were more finely separated. It was getting closer to that immersive, ethereal vibe of the Nagra Tube DAC. It wasn't quite there, maybe 85%. But this is now, if you take the RD160 and the analog bridge, $8,000, $9,000 versus $50,000, and you're close to that type of vibe, right? I was sitting there listening saying, I don't need to plug the Nagra back in because this is really beautiful. Now, I also made the mistake, I did a crazy comparison. I used to do these in the photography world where I would compare a Leica against a small Olympus, right? So I compared the RD160 against a $70,000 Nagra HD DAC X. This is a current model DAC. Even though Nagra has now released their reference DAC at close to 100K, this HD DAC X is just simply other level. Other level, it's done things that I can't even believe within this system. So compared to that, taking the RD160 and the analog bridge, you're about 75, 80% of that Nagra HD DAC X. And I don't mean, that 20%, that's where most of the magic and the emotion live. Now, the RD160 and analog bridge bring that emotion, just not to the level of a $70,000 DAC. It shouldn't be expected to. But I love pitting underdogs against the higher ups. So sometimes the underdogs get really close. And in this case, they got kind of close to that $70,000 DAC. If I take away the analog bridge, that shrinks a little bit more. Maybe you're now down to 60%. But we shouldn't be comparing this to a $70,000 DAC. That's just ridiculous. It's not meant to be compared to that. My point is, this is a DAC that punches way above its price point. I put this DAC, sound quality-wise, in the 10K price bracket. Even looking inside this DAC, the build quality is astonishing. They carefully selected the parts, the wire, everything here is all really well done. And I really didn't expect anything less from HiFi Rose. So the HiFi Rose RD160 DAC is an incredible DAC that gives me flavors and vibes of a $10,000 Weiss 501 DAC. It's got awesome features, making it compatible with any power amplifier you want to hook it up to with that variable output. If you want to hook it up to your integrated amp, there is a fixed output. You just set it to the fixed level. This is a beautiful DAC through and through. It has all the inputs you could ask for, I2 squared, coax, USB, the fiber USB. With the RS130, it's a match made in heaven. So if you have an RS130, this is the DAC I recommend to go with the RS130. If you want a DAC that's a little warm, solid, gives you everything you're looking for, maybe not that top percent of magic, but you know, who wants to pay for that? This gets so close. This is a great DAC. HiFi Rose released and created a great DAC. I've had no issues. There's no like crazy firmware stuff that happens with some of their streamers. This is just built to work, and work it does. The displays are also really cool. I like when you're listening and after a few minutes have passed by, it switches to the graphic display and you could see, you know, the graphs of the music. It's kind of a cool, unique design. Maybe not for everyone, but yeah, this is a DAC that sits in the mid-tier price at $5,300. What? Somebody just yelled out $5,300 is mid-tier. That's high-end. When you have DACs that cost $150,000, and there are DACs that cost $150,000, I would say $5,000 is mid-tier. So this is a mid-tier DAC that sounds like more like a higher-end DAC. Highly recommended for a DAC if you're in the market for that. But where I found this really excelled, was hooking it up to a power amp and using it as a preamp and volume control all in one. And that creates a really simple system if you're just listening to digital music. You have your RS-130 or other streamer. You have the RD160 and you have a power amplifier or a set of monoblocks. Add your speakers and you have one heck of a high-end sounding, beautiful endgame digital streaming system. Thumbs up, highly recommend the RD160. Thank you all for watching. If you like what I do here, thumbs up and subscribe. And I love you all. I will see you guys in the next one. Bye.